Here is a man. He was not a bloodthirsty serial killer, nor was he a traitor to his country. Yet he was banished from his homeland by the very king to whom he had dedicated his entire life, condemned as a filthy creature deserving of death. He was forced to flee his castle in the dead of night, his name forbidden for decades, becoming a social corpse. Tragically, this same man stood at the absolute pinnacle of the British Empire's glory. He was a knight of the most noble order of the Garter, the governor of New South Wales, and the hero who bore the sword of state, the ultimate symbol of royal power, at the king's coronation. The world revered him as the perfect gentleman, yet overnight, he was reduced to a monster treated worse than a beast. The protagonist of this brutal paradox is none other than William Lygon, the 7th Earl Beauchamp. How could something so deeply personal, a secret so simple, loving someone of the same sex, completely annihilate the glorious history of a dynasty and sentence a man to a permanent exile that was worse than death? To comprehend how a god of the aristocracy became a pariah, we must return to the world that made him, a world of gilded perfection, rigid rules, and dangerous hypocrisies. It was a world where appearance was everything, and the truth was a dangerous weapon, kept sheathed in velvet, until someone decided to draw blood. William Lygon was born into a life that most people could only dream of, a life scripted by centuries of privilege. Inheriting the earldom at the tender age of 19, he did not just inherit a title, he inherited a kingdom. Madresfield Court was not merely a home, it was a testament to the power and permanence of the Lygon family. Nestled at the foot of the Malvern Hills, it was a place of moats and bridges, of vast libraries filled with the scent of old leather and vellum. Young William was the perfect heir to this legacy. He was handsome in a soft patrician way, deeply religious, and possessed of a gentle, almost artistic temperament that set him apart from the rougher, hunting-obsessed peers of his generation. While other young aristocrats were concerned with gambling or shooting pheasants, Beauchamp was concerned with beauty. He was a man of the arts and crafts movement, a lover of embroidery, interior design, and ritual. He transformed Madresfield into a temple of aesthetic perfection. He was the kind of man who would fret over the shade of a cushion or the placement of a vase, believing that surrounded by beauty, the human soul could flourish. This sensitivity, this pursuit of the exquisite, made him a beloved figure. To his tenants, he was a benevolent landlord. To the Liberal Party, he was a rising star, a man of conscience who believed in social reform and the betterment of the poor. By his late 20s, he had already governed a colony in Australia, representing Queen Victoria with pomp and dignity. When he carried the sword of state at the coronation of King George V, he looked every inch the pillar of the establishment. But a pillar cannot stand alone. In the Edwardian era, a man of his station required a wife, a hostess, a mother to his heirs. And in 1902, Beauchamp made what society considered the match of the century. He married Lady Lettice Grosvenor. If the Lygons were old money, the Grosvenors were limitless money. Lettice was the sister of Hugh Bendor, Grosvenor, the second Duke of Westminster, a man whose wealth was so vast it was virtually incalculable, owning great swathes of central London. The union of Beauchamp and Lettice was hailed as the merging of two great houses, a fairy tale romance that seemed to cement Beauchamp's position at the very apex of British society. On the surface, the marriage was a triumph. They were the golden couple of the age. Over the next decade, the nurseries at Madresfield Court filled with the sounds of 7 children, 3 sons and 4 daughters. Photographs from the era show a family that radiates happiness and stability. There is the Earl, looking fondly at his brood, There is Lettuce, the dutiful and quiet wife, and there are the children, growing up in a paradise of pony rides, picnics, and dressing up. They were a family that seemed to have it all, living in a bubble of protection that felt impenetrable. Beauchamp was a devoted father, far more involved in his children's lives than was typical for the time. He read to them, played with them, and showered them with affection. To the outside world, he was the model patriarch, the moral compass of his community. However, beneath the polished veneer of this Edwardian perfection, there was a current running deep and dark, a truth that was known but never spoken. It was the open secret that rippled through the drawing rooms of London and the smoking rooms of the exclusive gentlemen's clubs. William Lygon, the 7th Earl Beauchamp, loved men. In the early 20th century, this was not viewed simply as a sexual preference. It was a criminal offense, a moral abomination, and a fast track to social suicide. The ghost of Oscar Wilde still haunted the British consciousness. Wilde's trial and imprisonment in 1895 had sent a chill through the gay subculture of England, driving it underground. But for men like Beauchamp, men of immense wealth and unassailable social standing, the rules were different. There was a buffer zone of privilege. As long as one was discreet, as long as the servants were paid well, and as long as one did not frighten the horses, the aristocracy looked after its own. Beauchamp's life was a masterclass in this dangerous duality. At Madresfield, he was the pious churchman who read prayers to his household every morning. But behind closed doors, the footmen were often hired for their looks as much as their service. At Walmer Castle, his official residence as Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, the weekend parties became legendary. They were often strictly male affairs, gatherings of handsome young men, some from his own social circle, others from the working class, sailors, grooms, servants. In the safety of his own properties, guarded by the deference of his staff, Beauchamp lived the life he truly wanted. He believed, perhaps arrogantly, perhaps naively, that his position made him untouchable. He assumed that the loyalty of his class was stronger than the letter of the law. For years, this assumption held true. His political enemies knew, his social rivals knew. People whispered about why the handsome footmen at Madresfield were treated with such familiarity, or why the Earl seemed to prefer the company of his valet to that of his wife. But nobody moved against him. To expose a man like Beauchamp would be to pull a thread that could unravel the entire tapestry of the upper class. If they exposed him, who would be next? The brother of the Prime Minister? The cousin of the King? It was a precarious truce, a silence born of mutual vulnerability. Beauchamp walked through this minefield with a smile, secure in his golden cage, believing that the sun would always shine on Madresfield Court. But the tragedy of William Lygon is that he forgot the one rule of the jungle he inhabited. Predators do not attack when you are strong. They attack when you are distracted, and they attack from within the family. The tolerance that protected him was not infinite. It was fragile, dependent on the whims of powerful men, and unfortunately for Beauchamp, the most powerful man in his orbit, his own brother-in-law, was beginning to watch him with eyes full of hate. The contrast between Beauchamp and the Duke of Westminster could not have been more stark. While Beauchamp was a sensitive, liberal intellectual who abhorred violence and championed the underdog, the Duke, known to everyone as Bendor, was a brute force of nature. Bendor was a reactionary Tory, a man who loved hunting, racing, and women. He was aggressively masculine, notoriously anti-Semitic, and possessed of a volcanic temper. He viewed Beauchamp not just as a political opponent, but as a personal affront to the dignity of the Grosvenor family. He despised Beauchamp's effeminate mannerisms, his love of needlepoint, his soft voice, To Bendor, Beauchamp was everything a man should not be. For years, Bendor's hatred simmered, kept in check by the delicate balance of family politics. He watched as his sister Lettice lived what he considered a lie, seemingly oblivious to her husband's true nature. He watched as Beauchamp's influence in the Liberal Party grew. He watched, and he waited for a slip. He needed more than just rumors. He needed ammunition. He needed proof so damning, so vile, that not even the king could ignore it. The 1920s roared along, bringing with them a loosening of morals for some, but a tightening of anxiety for the old guard. The world was changing. The horrors of the First World War had shattered the old certainties. The aristocracy felt their grip on power slipping. In this climate of fear and uncertainty, the desire to enforce moral order became a weapon. Beauchamp, with his bohemian tastes and his disregard for the rigid masculinity of his peers, began to look less like an eccentric and more like a symptom of the decay that terrified the conservatives. As the decade turned, Beauchamp, now in his late 50s, perhaps grew careless. He traveled frequently to the continent, to places like Venice and Berlin, cities known for their sexual freedom. He surrounded himself with younger men, acting as a mentor and patron, blurring the lines between paternal affection and romantic desire. He was a man chasing his lost youth, trying to grab handfuls of happiness in a world that legally forbade it. He did not see the net closing in. He did not see that the protective silence of his class was about to be broken by a roar of vengeance. It is important to understand the innocence, or perhaps the willful blindness of his wife, Lettice. In the narrative of this tragedy, she often appears as a ghostly figure, drifting through the rooms of Madresfield, arranging flowers, overseeing the servants, completely unaware of the drama that was swirling around her husband. This was not stupidity, it was the product of her upbringing. Women of her class were raised in a hermetically sealed environment. They were taught to run a household, to be charming hostesses, and to produce heirs. They were not taught about the complexities of human sexuality. The very concept of homosexuality was alien to her, something that didn't exist in her world. This innocence made her vulnerable, a pawn to be used in the brutal game of chess between her husband and her brother. The stage was set for a conflict that was almost biblical in its dimensions. On one side, the gentle, cultured Earl, living a double life, convinced that his contributions to the state and his lineage would shield him. On the other side, the ruthless, fabulously wealthy Duke, motivated by a toxic cocktail of homophobia, political rivalry, and a twisted sense of family honor. And caught in the middle were 7 children, the innocent bystanders who worshipped their father and barely knew their uncle. Nobody at Madresfield Court, in those final golden days, could have predicted how fast the end would come. They played tennis on the lawns. They staged plays in the great hall. They laughed at the dinner table. They were living in the twilight of their own history, unaware that the sun was about to set forever. The catalyst for the explosion would not be a public arrest or a police raid, but a private investigation, funded by unlimited wealth and driven by unlimited malice. The detectives were already being hired. The whispers were being written down. The clock was ticking, not just for William Ligon, but for the entire liberal, tolerant vision of the world he represented. The darkness was gathering at the gates of Madresfield, and it was wearing the face of a family member. That darkness did not arrive by accident. It was manufactured, purchased, and cataloged by one man with the resources to dismantle a reputation as easily as he might demolish a tenant farm. The disintegration of Earl Beauchamp's life began not with a grand public error, but with the quiet scratching of pens in notebooks held by private investigators. These men were not concerned with the poetic tragedy of a fallen peer. They were concerned with dates, times, and the corroboration of specific sexual acts. The Duke of Westminster, Hugh Bendor Grosvenor, did not rely on gossip. Gossip was for the drawing rooms. Westminster wanted ammunition. He hired a team of private detectives to conduct a forensic audit of his brother-in-law's private life. This was a significant escalation. In the 1930s, the aristocracy often settled their disputes through social ostracization or quiet words in the right ears. To employ paid operatives to dig into the dirt of a fellow peer's bedroom was considered a breach of class solidarity. It was vulgar, it was aggressive, it was effective. The detectives targeted the weak link in the aristocratic armor, the servants. In a house like Madresfield Court, privacy was an illusion. The valet knew the Earl's body better than his wife did. The footmen knew who visited the master's bedroom after lights out. The chauffeurs knew which unauthorized stops were made on the way to official engagements. For years, this knowledge had been contained by a combination of loyalty, fear, and the unspoken feudal contract where discretion was exchanged for job security. Westminster broke that contract with money. His agents approached former staff members, men who had been dismissed or had moved on to other employment. They found the disgruntled, the underpaid, and the morally outraged. They asked specific questions. They didn't ask if the Earl was eccentric. They asked if he had committed sodomy. They asked for names of sexual partners. They asked for descriptions of physical encounters. The testimony they gathered was devastating. It detailed a pattern of behavior that had been going on for decades. Witnesses described the Earl's predilection for handsome young men, often employed in service. They detailed the atmosphere at Walmer Castle during the Lord Warden's parties, where rank was suspended and the usual barriers between master and servant dissolved in a haze of alcohol and sexual license. The detectives compiled a list of names, men who had been paid for their silence or their participation. This was not a collection of vague innuendos. It was a dossier of criminal evidence. Under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, specifically the Labouchere Amendment, any act of gross indecency between men, in public or private, was a crime. There was no requirement for a witness to the actual act. The intent and the circumstances were enough to secure a conviction. Westminster was building a case that would stand up in a court of law, but his intended courtroom was far more exclusive. The timing of this investigation coincided with a shift in Beauchamp's own behavior. By 1930, the Earl had become reckless. Perhaps he believed his high office protected him, or perhaps he simply stopped caring. He embarked on a tour of Australia, ostensibly to revisit the site of his former governorship. He did not travel alone. His entourage included his son, Hugh Lygon, and a young Liberal member of Parliament named Robert Burnet. Burnet is a crucial figure in this narrative. He was everything Beauchamp admired. Young, intellectual, politically ambitious, and witty, he was also a bachelor. The relationship between the older Earl and the young MP became the subject of intense speculation during the voyage. On the long sea journey, in the close confines of the ship, their intimacy was noted by fellow passengers. They were seen together constantly, often to the exclusion of others. They shared private jokes and an obvious physical comfort that transcended the usual boundaries of political mentorship. In Australia, the behavior continued. Beauchamp, treating the trip as a triumphal return, seemed to view the entire continent as his personal playground. He was feted by local dignitaries, but the whispers followed him from the receptions in Sydney to the sheep stations of the outback. Letters began to drift back to London. They spoke of the Earl's unfortunate manner, of his unsuitable companions, and more directly, of the scandal he was courting. Westminster received these reports with grim satisfaction. The Australia trip provided the contemporary evidence he needed to supplement the historical testimony of the servants. It proved that Beauchamp was not just a man with a past. He was an active current deviant who was bringing the British establishment into disrepute across the empire. The motivation for Westminster's vendetta requires deeper examination. It is insufficient to dismiss him merely as a homophobe, though he certainly was that. His hatred was systemic. Westminster was the embodiment of the ultra-Tory, rich, reactionary, and terrified of the changing world. The 1920s and 30s were decades of profound anxiety for men like him. Socialism was on the rise. The Labour Party had formed governments. The empire was showing cracks. The old order was under siege. To Westminster, Beauchamp represented the internal rot of the aristocracy. Beauchamp was a liberal, a man who had supported the Parliament Act of 1911, which broke the power of the House of Lords. He was a man who believed in internationalism and reform. In Westminster's worldview, Beauchamp was a class traitor politically, and his sexual behavior was just the physical manifestation of his moral corruption. By destroying Beauchamp, Westminster believed he was performing a sanitary service for his class. He was cutting out a cancer. There was also a purely personal element. Westminster was a man who required dominance. He treated his wives, his mistresses, and his family as possessions. He found Beauchamp's presence in the family, his connection to the Grosvenor bloodline through lettuce, intolerable. He had mocked Beauchamp for years, deriding his taste for interior decoration and his gentle demeanor. Now he had the power to crush him. It was a sport, a hunt. Westminster pursued Beauchamp with the same relentless energy he applied to fox hunting, only the stakes were a man's life rather than a brush. By early 1931, the dossier was complete. It was a thick document, heavy with sworn statements. It contained the names of footmen at Madresfield, sailors at Walmer, and details of the Bernays affair. It was, in legal terms, a hanging case. Westminster did not rush to the police station. That would have been clumsy. A police investigation would become public immediately. The press would get hold of it. Earl arrested would be the headline, and the mud would splatter onto everyone, including the Grosvenors. Westminster wanted a surgical strike. He wanted Beauchamp gone, obliterated, but he wanted to control the blast radius. He began to circulate the information within the highest echelons of society. He showed the evidence to key figures in the House of Lords. He spoke to senior Tories. He ensured that the support for Beauchamp was eroded foundation by foundation. Men who had dined with Beauchamp for 20 years suddenly found themselves looking at the floor when his name was mentioned. The open secret was being weaponized. It was no longer a quirk to be tolerated. It was a crime to be punished. The Liberal Party, of which Beauchamp was the leader in the Lords, was paralyzed. They were already a fading political force, squeezed between the Conservatives and Labour. They could not afford a scandal of this magnitude. When rumors of the dossier reached the party grandees, their instinct was self-preservation. They did not rally around their leader. They stepped back, leaving him exposed. Beauchamp was isolated. He had no political capital left to spend. The isolation was physical as well as political. Beauchamp began to notice the change in the atmosphere. Invitations dried up. Conversation stopped when he entered rooms at his clubs. The distinct chill of social death preceded the legal execution. He was being ghosted by his own life. Westminster, however, needed the final sanction. He needed the highest authority in the land to validate his crusade. He needed the king. King George V was a man of simple, rigid codes. He viewed the monarchy as the ultimate guardian of British morality. He had spent his reign trying to steady the ship of state through war and social upheaval. He valued duty, family, and propriety above all else. The King and Queen Mary had a personal relationship with Beauchamp. They had stayed at Madresfield. They had broken bread with him. Westminster knew that the King's reaction to the dossier would be one of personal betrayal. He knew the King would not see a legal case. He would see a pollution of his court. Westminster secured an audience. He did not go to the palace to ask for advice. He went to deliver an ultimatum. He laid out the evidence. He detailed the specific acts. He named the men involved. The reaction was exactly what he calculated. The King was not just angry, he was nauseated. The famous remark, "I thought men like that shot themselves," was not a throwaway line. It was a genuine expression of the King's worldview. In his mind, Beauchamp had ceased to be a gentleman and had become something subhuman. The fact that this man had carried the sword of state, a sacred symbol of royal authority, was a stain that had to be scrubbed out. The King's revulsion was the key that turned the lock. With the monarch turned against him, Beauchamp had no defenders left. The establishment closed ranks. The decision was made that Beauchamp must be removed from public life entirely. There would be no trial, for a trial was too noisy. There would be an erasure. Westminster returned to his sister Lettice with the news. He presented himself as the savior of the family honor. He told her the details. He shattered her ignorance with brutal efficiency. He demanded she leave Madresfield. He demanded she initiate divorce proceedings. He took control of her life as completely as he had taken control of her husband's fate. At Madresfield, the Earl was still unaware of the precision of the strike being prepared against him. He knew there were rumors. He knew Westminster was hostile, but he could not conceive of the totality of the betrayal. He still believed that the rules of his class applied. He believed that his rank was a shield. He did not realize that his rank was merely the target. The trap was set. The legal papers were drawn. The director of public prosecutions was briefed. The King was waiting for the resignation. Westminster was waiting for the surrender. The tragedy of William Lygon was that he was the last person to know that his life was already over. He was a dead man walking through the beautiful rooms of his ancestral home, while miles away in London, the warrant for his arrest was being typed out, stark and black against the white paper. The catalyst had done its work. The explosion was imminent. The dossier did not stay in Westminster's safe. In the spring of 1931, the Duke made his move, taking the evidence directly to the pinnacle of the British social hierarchy, Buckingham Palace. He requested a private audience with King George V. This was a calculated breach of protocol. Ordinarily, legal matters went through the courts or the Home Office, but Westminster knew that the law was secondary to the reputation of the Crown. He wasn't reporting a crime, he was reporting a contamination. The meeting between the Duke and the King was brief and brutal. George V was a man of the 19th century, a former naval officer with a rigid, binary view of morality. He valued discipline, duty, and a straight-laced domesticity that he had imposed on the royal household. When Westminster laid out the particulars of Earl Beauchamp's life, the affairs with servants, the parties at Walmer Castle, the relationship with Robert Bernays, the King's reaction was immediate. It was not the reaction of a judge weighing evidence, but of a man confronting something physically repulsive. Beauchamp was not a stranger to the King. He was a knight of the Garter, the highest order of chivalry in England. He had carried the sword of state. He was a frequent guest at royal functions. To George V, the revelation was a personal insult. It meant he had harbored a deviant in the heart of his court. The King's reported response to the news has become the defining epitaph of the scandal. "I thought men like that shot themselves. This sentence reveals the lethal simplicity of the era's mindset. In the king's view, Beauchamp's behavior was a terminal failure of character. It was a betrayal of his breeding. The only honorable course of action for a man caught in such disgrace was suicide. It was the expected solution, a single gunshot in the library to save the family from the shame of a trial. The king was appalled that Beauchamp was still alive, still walking around, still pretending to be a gentleman. But there was a deeper, more urgent fear driving the king's fury. The scandal threatened the royal family itself. The king's fourth son, Prince George, the Duke of Kent, was a frequent visitor to Madresfield Court. Prince George was wild, artistic, and bisexual. He moved in the same bohemian circles as the Ligon children. There were rumors of drug use and affairs with both men and women. Even more dangerously, there had been serious talk of a marriage between Prince George and Beauchamp's daughter, Lady Mary Ligon. The king realized that if Beauchamp fell publicly, the splash damage would hit his son. If a trial exposed the lifestyle at Madresfield, questions would be asked about who else had attended those parties. The name of the Duke of Kent could be dragged into the witness box. The monarchy, already navigating the difficult political waters of the 1930s, could not afford a scandal that linked a senior royal to gross indecency. The king's directive was clear. Beauchamp had to go. The machinery of the establishment shifted gears from protection to liquidation. The king demanded Beauchamp's resignation from all official posts. He was stripped of his lord wardenship of the Cinque Ports. He was forced to resign as Chancellor of the University of London and as leader of the Liberal Party in the House of Lords. The message was sent down the line: William Ligon was no longer a person of consequence. He was a liability to be excised. This was the brutal efficiency of the British class system in action. For 30 years, they had tolerated Beauchamp because he was one of them. Now, in the span of a few days, they decided he was a cancer. There was no loyalty to his past service, no consideration for his family. The ranks closed. Friends who had drunk his wine for decades suddenly became unavailable. The silence that had once protected him was replaced by a different kind of silence, the silence of social execution. However, resignation was not enough for the Duke of Westminster. He wanted total destruction. He pushed for criminal charges. The Director of Public Prosecutions was informed, and a warrant was prepared for the arrest of Earl Beauchamp on charges of homosexual offenses. This was the nuclear option. Prison for men of Beauchamp's class was rare, but not unprecedented. The memory of Oscar Wilde breaking rocks in Reading jail was the nightmare scenario. But the authorities faced a dilemma. A trial was exactly what the king wanted to avoid. A trial meant headlines. It meant public testimony about the sexual habits of the aristocracy. It meant the Grosvenor and Ligon names, and by extension the crown, being dragged through the mud of the Old Bailey. A compromise was reached. It was a gentleman's agreement of the cruelest sort. The warrant would be issued, but it would not be executed immediately. Beauchamp would be given a head start. He would be allowed to flee the country. If he stayed, he would be arrested and ruined. If he left, he would be in exile, but a free one. It was a forced deportation disguised as a holiday. The ultimatum was delivered to Beauchamp at Madresfield Court on June 8, 1931. The messenger was likely Lord Stanmore, the Liberal chief whip, acting as the grim reaper of Beauchamp's political life. The terms were non-negotiable: leave England by midnight or go to prison. The shock was total. Beauchamp had assumed the storm would blow over, or that his rank would insulate him from the worst consequences. He had not calculated the sheer ferocity of Westminster's hatred or the king's personal revulsion. Suddenly, the abstract threat became a concrete reality. He had hours to dismantle a life that had taken 59 years to build. There was no time for a defense strategy. There was no time to rally supporters. The Liberal Party had already abandoned him. The king had disowned him. He was alone. The scene at Madresfield that afternoon was one of quiet, frantic desperation. There was no shouting, no dramatic speeches, just the hasty packing of trunks. Beauchamp moved through the house like a ghost. He selected a few books, some clothes, personal papers. He looked at the things he would never see again. The arts and crafts chapel he had commissioned, the crystal chandeliers, the gardens he had designed with such care. He was being evicted from his own history. He said goodbye to his children, a hurried, confused parting. They did not fully understand what was happening. They knew there was trouble. They knew Uncle Bendor was angry. But the enormity of the situation, that their father was leaving forever, was impossible to grasp in the moment. Beauchamp did not burden them with the sordid details. He maintained his dignity to the end, playing the role of the calm patriarch even as his world collapsed. By early evening, the car was waiting. Beauchamp walked out of the heavy front doors of Madresfield Court. He did not look back. He was driven to the port of Dover. The police were aware of his movements. They had orders to let him pass. He boarded the night ferry to the continent. As the white cliffs of Dover faded into the darkness, William Lygon ceased to be a peer of the realm in any practical sense. He was now a fugitive. Back in England, the vacuum he left was filled instantly by the Duke of Westminster. Bendor moved to consolidate his victory. His primary target now was his sister Lettice. Lettice was the collateral damage of the war between the two men. Westminster descended on her with the force of an avalanche. He stripped away her illusions. He told her everything. He detailed the contents of the dossier, the grooms, the footmen, the years of deception. He did not do this to comfort her. He did it to control her. He needed Lettice to be the victim, the wronged woman who required her brother's protection. He moved her out of Madresfield Court immediately. He installed her in one of his own properties, effectively placing her under house arrest. He dictated her correspondence. He cut her off from the Lygon influence. He ordered her to file for divorce. In 1931, divorce was scandalous, but Westminster calculated that remaining married to a criminal lunatic, as he called Beauchamp, was worse. He bullied her into submission. Lettice, shell-shocked and humiliated, crumbled under the pressure. She did what her brother told her. She became the plaintiff in a legal action against the man she had been married to for 29 years. But Westminster made a critical error. He forgot the children. He assumed that the Lygon children, William, Viscount Elmley, Hugh, Mary, Dorothy, Richard, Lettice, and Sibel, would naturally side with their mother and their powerful uncle. He assumed they would be disgusted by their father's perversion. He assumed they would want to scrub the stain from their name. He was wrong. The reaction of the Lygon children is the most extraordinary twist in this saga. It defied every social norm of the 1930s. In a world where homosexuality was loathed, and where the head of the family, the Duke of Westminster, commanded absolute deference, the children mutinied. They rejected the narrative that their father was a monster. They knew him as a man of kindness, humor, and love. They compared the gentle, affectionate father who had been forced into exile with the bullying, arrogant uncle who had destroyed their home. The choice was instinctive. They chose the exile. Led by Lady Dorothy, known as Coot, and Lady Mary, known as Mamie, the siblings formed a defensive phalanx around their father's memory. They viewed their mother's decision to divorce him not as an act of self-preservation, but as an act of betrayal. They saw her as weak, a puppet of the hated Uncle Bendor. The family split down the middle, but the numbers were on Beauchamp's side. Elmley, the heir, was cautious. He had a political career to protect and eventually had to manage the estate. But his sympathies lay with his father. Hugh, the second son, was openly gay himself and adored his father. The scandal devastated him, pushing him further into alcoholism. The daughters were ferocious. They refused to testify against their father. They refused to acknowledge the social stigma. They declared war on the Duke of Westminster. It was a social war, fought with silences and snubs. They refused to speak to him. They refused to be in the same room as him. When he sent gifts, they returned them. To them, he was not the savior of the family honor. He was its destroyer. They referred to him with cold contempt. This rebellion had a devastating effect on Lettuce. She found herself rescued by her brother, but abandoned by her children. She was left alone in the wreckage. The divorce proceeded, a dry, legal formality that officially ended the marriage. But the emotional verdict had already been delivered by the children. They blamed her. They stopped visiting her. She spent her final years in a twilight of regret, a woman who had followed the rules of her class, only to find that those rules had left her solitary and unloved. Meanwhile, on the continent, Beauchamp began his wandering. The transition from English earl to stateless nomad was jarring. He settled initially in Germany, then moved through France and Italy. He had money. The family trusts ensured he wasn't destitute, but he had no purpose. He was a man defined by his public service and his estate, and both had been stripped away. He stayed in grand hotels, a lonely figure in the dining rooms of Venice and Paris. He wrote constant letters to his children, letters filled with mundane details about the weather or the architecture, avoiding the gaping wound of his exile. He tried to maintain the facade of a gentleman on a grand tour, but everyone knew the truth. He was on the run. The fear of arrest never fully vanished, though the warrant was effectively dormant as long as he stayed out of Britain. There was always the anxiety of extradition or a change in political winds. He was careful. He avoided British diplomats. He kept a low profile. But even in exile, he refused to become the villain Westminster wanted him to be. He did not rail against the injustice. He did not sell his story to the press. He maintained a stoic silence. When his children visited him, clandestine trips that felt like pilgrimages, he was cheerful. He asked about the dogs at Madresfield. He asked about the gardens. He never asked about Lettuce. He never mentioned Westminster's name. The children's visits became the lifeline that kept him tethered to reality. They would pack into cars and drive across Europe to find him. They brought him news of the real world. They recreated a miniature version of Madresfield in hotel suites in Salzburg or villas in the south of France. For a few weeks at a time, he could pretend he was still the patriarch, still the center of a loving family. However, the tragedy of Hugh Lygon, the second son, began to weigh heavily on the exiled earl. Hugh was the most fragile of the children. He had inherited his father's charm and his sexuality, but none of his resilience. The scandal of 1931 broke Hugh. He drifted aimlessly, drinking heavily to numb the shame and the loss of his home. He became the model for Sebastian Flyte in Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, the beautiful boy clutching a teddy bear, slowly drowning in alcohol. Beauchamp watched his son's decline from a distance, powerless to intervene. He could not bring Hugh home to Madresfield to recover. He could not use his influence to get him a position. He could only watch as the sins of the father, or rather the punishment of the father, visited the son. By the mid-1930s, the political landscape of Europe was darkening. The rise of Nazism in Germany made the continent a less hospitable place for a wandering English liberal. Beauchamp moved further afield, returning to Australia for a time. seeking solace in the one place where he had been a success without the baggage of his final years. But the distance from his children was unbearable. He returned to Europe, settling into a pattern of restless movement, a man trying to outrun his own shadow. Back in England, the silence around his name solidified. The establishment had successfully erased him. He was the man who wasn't there. In the House of Lords, his seat was empty. At the coronation of George VI in 1937, where he should have played a prominent role, he was absent. The new king was less rigid than his father, but the ban remained. The warrant was still in a drawer somewhere in Whitehall. The Lygon children continued their guerrilla war against the silence. They talked about their father constantly. They toasted him at dinners. They made it clear to London society that to be a friend of the Lygons, you had to be a friend of the exile. They forced society to confront the awkward reality that the monster was still loved, and the hero, Westminster, was despised. As 1938 approached, the physical toll of the exile became apparent. Beauchamp was losing weight. His energy was fading. The psychological stress of the last 7 years, the humiliation, the fear, the separation, was manifesting as physical illness. He was dying not of a broken heart, which is a poetic fiction, but of the very real stress of a life dismantled by hate. He traveled to New York, perhaps seeking better medical treatment, or perhaps just another place to hide. It was there, in a city of strangers, that the final act of his life would play out. Far from the Malvern Hills, far from the rose gardens of Madresfield, the 7th Earl Beauchamp prepared to face the one judge who could not be bribed by a duke or commanded by a king. New York City in the late autumn of 1938 offered a cold, metallic sort of anonymity. For William Lygon, now physically frail and living in the Hotel Gotham, the city was a final refuge. It was far enough from London to silence the whispers, yet vibrant enough to distract a man from his own dying. He was 66 years old. The cancer was advanced. The grand tour of exile that had taken him from Venice to Sydney and back was ending not in the moated grandeur of Madresfield Court, but in a rented room in Manhattan. The tragedy of his final years was not just the exile itself, but the losses he sustained while banned from his homeland. 2 years earlier, in 1936, the blow had landed that likely finished him. His second son, Hugh Lygon, the golden boy, the beloved, the troubled soul, had died in Germany. Hugh was 31. He had been on a motoring trip, a desperate attempt to outrun his own alcoholism and the family shame. He collapsed by the side of a road, his body finally giving out. Beauchamp had received the news by telegram. The cruelty of his situation was absolute. He could not go to his son. He could not stand at the graveside in England. The warrant for his arrest was technically dormant, but the risk of a spectacle was too high, and his own health was too poor. He had to mourn from a distance, stuck in a hotel room in Paris while his favorite son was lowered into the Worcestershire earth. That grief hollowed him out. The cancer that claimed him in New York was merely finishing the job that the death of Hugh had started. On November 14, 1938, the end came. There were no royal physicians, no bowing courtiers. William Lygon died with only a few loyal friends, and perhaps the ghosts of his former life for company. The formidable 7th Earl Beauchamp, the man who had once governed New South Wales and walked in the coronation procession of kings, was gone. His death presented an immediate logistical and diplomatic problem. He was an exile, a pariah, yet still a peer of the realm. The family, specifically the children, moved instantly to reclaim him. They would not allow him to be buried in a foreign grave. They arranged for his body to be transported back across the Atlantic. The return of the body was the first time William Lygon had legally entered England in 7 years. The warrant for his arrest died with him. The establishment could no longer punish him, so they chose to ignore him. There was no state funeral, no memorial service in Westminster Abbey. The newspapers, which had maintained a respectful but loaded silence during his exile, noted his passing with brief sanitized obituaries that listed his offices but omitted the reason for his departure. They spoke of health reasons and travel abroad. The British talent for euphemism was working at full capacity. The funeral at Madresfield Court was a tense, defiant reclaiming of the patriarch. The Lygon children, now adults, stood united. They buried their father in the family plot, restoring him to the soil he had loved. The absences were glaring. The Duke of Westminster did not attend. His presence would have caused a riot among the siblings. The king sent no representative. The political colleagues who had abandoned him in 1931 remained absent. It was a private closing of the ranks. With the earth settled over the grave, the immediate scandal ended. But the story of the Lygons was about to undergo a strange literary metamorphosis. The facts of William Lygon's life were buried, but the myth of his life was about to be written by a man who had watched the tragedy unfold from the front row. Evelyn Waugh was not family, but he was the next best thing. A fixture. The sharp-tongued, ambitious writer had met the Lygon children at Oxford in the 1920s. He had been captivated by them. They were everything he wanted to be: ancient, titled, wealthy, eccentric, and beautiful. He had fallen in love with the family as a collective entity. He spent weeks at Madresfield Court, drinking their wine, hunting in their woods, and observing their dynamics with the cold, predatory eye of a novelist. Waugh knew everything. He knew about the Earl's affairs. He knew about the open secret. He was best friends with Hugh Lygon and had watched Hugh's descent into alcoholism. He was a confidant of the daughters, particularly Lady Dorothy and Lady Mary. When the crash came in 1931, Waugh watched the brutal efficiency of the Duke of Westminster's coup. He saw the family shattered. He saw the closing of the house. Years later, in the midst of the Second World War, Waugh found himself feeling nostalgic for the vanished world of the 1920s aristocracy. He began to write Brideshead Revisited. It is impossible to overstate the theft. Brideshead Revisited is not merely inspired by the Lygons. It is an architectural and emotional reconstruction of them. Madresfield Court is Brideshead Castle. The details are specific. The Art Nouveau chapel with its painted angels, the fountain in the courtyard, the library. Waugh lifted the physical reality of the Lygon home and dropped it onto the page. But he did more than steal the house, he stole the people. Lord Marchmain, the novel's patriarch, is a direct portrait of Earl Beauchamp. Marchmain is an exile living in Venice, driven from England by a scandal that society refuses to name. He is charming, aloof, and tragic. However, Waugh made a critical adjustment for the sensibilities of 1945. In the book, Lord Marchmain is exiled because he hates his wife and lives with an Italian mistress. Waugh straightened the scandal. He replaced homosexuality with adultery. This change allowed the book to be published and become a bestseller, but it masked the true nature of the tragedy. The real Lord Marchmain, Beauchamp, didn't leave because he fell out of love. He left because the police were coming. He didn't live with a mistress. He lived with the shame of criminalization. Waugh kept the pain of the exile, the sense of a great man cut off from his roots. But he removed the specific cause, rendering the story safe for the public, while keeping it recognizable to the insiders who knew the truth. The character of Sebastian Flyte is an elegy for Hugh Lygon. Sebastian is the beautiful doomed boy who carries a teddy bear, Aloysius, and drinks to obliterate his reality. Hugh Ligon traveled with a teddy bear. Hugh Ligon drank himself to death. Waugh's portrayal of Sebastian is suffused with a deep melancholy love, a reflection of his own complex relationship with Hugh. The tragedy of Sebastian in the novel, dying slowly in a monastery in Tunisia, is a softer, more spiritual version of Hugh's death on a German roadside. The Ligon daughters, too, found themselves trapped in amber. Lady Mary became Julia Flight, the dark-haired beauty torn between duty and desire. Lady Dorothy became Cordelia, the plain, sensible, fiercely religious younger sister. When the book was published in 1945, it became a sensation. For the Ligon children, reading it must have been a surreal, disorienting experience. Here was their trauma, their house, their father, and their dead brother, repackaged as a Catholic romance. Waugh had immortalized them, but he had also frozen them. The world would forever see them as the Flights, the doomed romantic figures of a lost age, rather than the survivors of a brutal political hit job. The legacy of the scandal did not end with the book. The silence that the establishment imposed on the Beauchamp affair was incredibly effective. For decades, the true reason for the Earl's flight was suppressed. Biographies of the era talked around it. Memoirs of politicians omitted it. It wasn't until the late 20th century, well after the decriminalization of homosexuality in 1967, that the full story began to emerge. The Ligon survivors, specifically the women, lived on with remarkable resilience. Lady Dorothy, Coote, became a legendary figure in her own right, a pipe-smoking, tweed-wearing countrywoman who served in the Waif during the war and lived until 1985. She never married, devoting her life to her friends and the memory of her family. Lady Mary, the woman who might have been a royal duchess, if not for the scandal, eventually married a Russian prince. But the marriage failed. She lived a bohemian, often difficult life, forever marked by the events of 1931. Viscount Elmley, the eldest son, succeeded as the 8th Earl Beauchamp. He was a different creature entirely, cautious, eccentric in his own way, and deeply protective of the family name. He lived at Madresfield, guarding the house like a fortress. But the dynasty was running out of time. The 8th Earl had no children. When he died in 1979, the title passed to a distant cousin, but the direct line of the Beauchamp Belles and their tragic father was effectively extinguished. Today, Madresfield Court still stands. It is one of the few great houses that has never been sold, passing by descent through the female line. It remains a private home, not a National Trust museum. The rooms where the detectives interviewed the footmen are still there. The chapel where Beauchamp prayed is still there. The story of William Ligon serves as a grim autopsy of the British class system between the wars. It exposes the lie of the gentleman's code. The code was not about honor. It was about exclusivity. You could do anything you wanted as long as you were useful. The moment you became a liability, the protection evaporated. Beauchamp's crime was not that he loved men. His crime was that he got caught in the crossfire of a power struggle between a vindictive duke and a terrified king. He was a casualty of a moral panic. He was a man who lived 40 years as a pillar of the state and died as a fugitive, deleted from the official record. In the end, the aristocratic exile is not just a story about a gay peer. It is a story about the fragility of status. It proves that no amount of gold, no ancient title, and no royal friendship can save you when the machinery of the state decides you are disposable. William Ligon thought he was safe because he was Earl Beauchamp. He forgot that earls are created by the system. and the system can unmake them just as easily. The silence has finally lifted. We can now look at the portrait of the seventh Earl, the kindly man with the soft eyes, and see him not as a cautionary tale or a criminal, but as a man who paid an impossible price for the simple human need to be himself. The house remembers, and now so do we. The silence that descended on Madresfield Court was not the peace of resolution. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a crime scene, where the body has been removed but the blood stain remains. While William Lygon lay in the family plot, the architect of his destruction, the Duke of Westminster, remained one of the most powerful men in the British Empire. Justice in the 1930s was not blind. It was bought. Westminster's survival and continued dominance serve as the grotesque counterweight to Beauchamp's exile. It proves that the scandal was never about morality. It was about power. Westminster, known as Bendor, paid no price for dismantling a family. He did not lose his position. He did not lose his friends. In the years following Beauchamp's flight, Bendor's behavior became increasingly erratic and offensive. He flirted with fascism, expressing admiration for Hitler, and engaging in virulent anti-Semitism. He named one of his dogs with a racial slur. He continued to pursue women with predatory entitlement, famously wooing Coco Chanel, who ultimately rejected him. Yet, the establishment that had recoiled in horror at Beauchamp's consensual private life had no issue with Westminster's public bigotry. He remained a duke. He remained invited. He remained protected. This double standard is the rusted core of the story. Beauchamp was erased for loving the wrong way. Westminster was celebrated despite hating the wrong way. Bendor died in 1953, phenomenally wealthy and entirely unrepentant. His legacy is etched in the street names of Mayfair and the grand buildings of Belgravia, while Beauchamp's legacy was buried in a police file and a coded novel. The contrast is sharp and unforgiving. The gentleman died in exile. The bully died in his bed. The other victim of Westminster's scorched earth policy was his own sister, Lettice. History has often painted her as a vague, oblivious figure, but her reality was far starker. She was a woman broken by coercive control. Westminster did not rescue her from a sham marriage. He abducted her into a life of isolation. After the forced divorce, Lettice became a ghost. Her children, fierce in their loyalty to their exiled father, viewed her compliance with Westminster as treason. They cut her off. There is no romance in this estrangement. It was brutal. When Lettice died in 1936, she was 59, the same age her husband had been when he fled. She died estranged from the children she had raised, living in a house that wasn't hers, controlled by a brother who viewed her as property. The Lygon children did not attend her funeral in force. They sent flowers, but their hearts were with the exile in Paris. Lettice was the collateral damage of a feud she barely understood, a woman crushed between the irresistible force of her brother's malice and the immovable object of her children's loyalty. The children themselves, the Beauchamp Belle, as the daughters were known, became the keepers of the flame. Lady Mary, Mamie, and Lady Dorothy Coote did not hide in the shadows. They lived loud, defiant lives in London. They turned their shared apartment into a salon for the artistic and the bohemian, a safe harbor for the kind of people their uncle despised. They walked a tightrope. They were the daughters of a criminal, yet they remained at the center of high society. They achieved this through sheer force of personality. They dared people to cut them, and few had the courage to try. Mamie's life, however, carried the scars of the scandal. She had been on the brink of royalty, courted by Prince George, Duke of Kent. The scandal ended that possibility instantly. Instead of becoming a royal duchess, she drifted. In 1939, she married Prince of Vsevolod Ivanovich of Russia, a refugee Romanov. It seemed like a glamorous match, but the reality was grim. The prince was dependent, and the marriage was unhappy, fueled by alcohol and financial strain. Mamie, like her brother Hugh, found solace in the bottle. She had lost her father, her royal future, and her family home. The resilience she showed in public masked a private disintegration. Coote was the survivor. She was the one who drove ambulances during the war, the one who managed the family's remaining affairs, the one who kept the secrets. She was the anchor. It was Coote who received the manuscript of Brideshead Revisited from Evelyn Waugh. Reading it must have been a visceral violation. Waugh, their friend, had taken the most painful elements of their lives, the alcoholism of Hugh, the exile of their father, the closing of the house, and turned them into entertainment. He had colonized their tragedy. Waugh's betrayal was intimate. He had eaten at their table at Madresfield. He had flirted with them. He had watched Hugh Ligon drink himself into a stupor, and then wrote those scenes almost verbatim into the character of Sebastian Flyte. When the book came out in 1945, the Ligons had to watch the world fall in love with a fictionalized version of their pain. They were trapped in Waugh's amber. To the public, they were the Flytes. The reality of their struggle, the police warrants, the blackmail, the gritty details of survival, was washed away by Waugh's golden, nostalgic prose. He gave them immortality, but he stole their truth. Madresfield Court itself stands as the final witness. Most great English estates did not survive the 20th century. They were sold off, demolished, or turned into hotels and golf courses. The taxes and the loss of heirs killed them. Madresfield survived. It survived the scandal, the absence of its master, and the financial pressures of the post-war era. It survived because of the stubbornness of the line. The house today is a time capsule. The Art Nouveau decorations commissioned by Beauchamp, the very aesthetic that Westminster mocked as effeminate, are now recognized as masterpieces. The chapel, with its intricate paintings and arts and crafts detailing, is widely considered one of the most beautiful small churches in England. The irony is palpable, the perversions of Earl Beauchamp, his love of beauty, his patronage of artists, his rejection of the stark, masculine utility of his class, are the very things that saved the house. He made it unique. He made it a treasure. The boring, dutiful peers who hunted and shot and conformed left behind houses that were forgettable. Beauchamp left behind a work of art. The library at Madresfield still holds the books he read. The archives still hold the letters he wrote from exile. The physical space asserts his presence. You cannot walk through the halls without sensing the man who designed them. Westminster tried to erase him from history, but he failed to erase him from the architecture. The stone and mortar proved more durable than the social register. Legally, the shadow over Beauchamp's life extended far beyond his death. The laws that condemned him remained in force in Britain until 1967. For another 3 decades after he died in New York, men were still being arrested, imprisoned, and ruined for the same crimes. The computer pioneer Alan Turing was chemically castrated in 1952. Thousands of ordinary men faced blackmail and jail. Beauchamp was not an anomaly. He was a high-profile casualty in a war that lasted a century. However, Beauchamp's specific fate, exile rather than prison, highlights the class divide in British justice. He was allowed to leave. A working-class man caught in a public toilet or a park would have been in handcuffs within the hour. Beauchamp was granted the gentleman's exit. This wasn't mercy, it was pragmatism. The establishment didn't want to put an earl in the dock because it looked bad for the establishment. They protected the title, not the man. They saved the dignity of the Garter, not the dignity of William Lygon. Looking back at the scandal now, the tragedy is often framed as inevitable. The narrative goes that a man like Beauchamp could never survive in a time like that. This is false. He survived for decades. He was destroyed not by the inevitable march of history, but by the specific, calculated actions of specific individuals. It was a hit. It was a targeted removal. The loss was political as well as personal. Beauchamp was a liberal leader in the House of Lords. During the crucial years leading up to World War II, he was an internationalist. He was a man who believed in diplomacy and peace. Removing him from the board in 1931 left the Liberal Party leaderless and weak in the upper house. We cannot know if his presence would have changed the course of British politics in the 1930s, but we know that a voice of sanity was silenced just as the world was going mad. The Duke of Westminster didn't just ruin a family, he removed a statesman. The Lygon story effectively ends the era of the Grand Whiggery, that specific breed of aristocratic liberalism that combined vast wealth with a sense of social duty and bohemian tolerance. After Beauchamp, the aristocracy retreated. They became quieter, more conservative, more fearful. The colorful, eccentric, dangerous confidence of the Edwardian age died in that car ride to Dover. Today, the 8th Earl Beauchamp is long dead. The title is extinct. The direct male line failed. In a dynastic sense, Westminster won. He successfully terminated the Beauchamp lineage. But in the court of history, the verdict has flipped. Westminster is remembered, if at all, as a bigot and a bully. Beauchamp is remembered with a growing sense of respect and sorrow. We see the photos of him at Madresfield, the kindness in the face, the hand resting gently on a child's shoulder, and we see a modern man trapped in a medieval code. The scandal of 1931 is no longer a story of shame. It is an indictment of a society that valued conformity over humanity. It is a lesson in how fragility lurks behind even the thickest walls of privilege. William Lygon built a paradise at Madresfield, but he forgot to build a fortress. He trusted in the goodwill of his peers, and that was his fatal error. As the gates of Madresfield Court close on this story, the lasting image is not of the exile dying in a New York hotel, nor of the king shaking his head in disgust. The lasting image is of the house itself. It sits in the Malvern Hills, beautiful, complex, and defiant. It holds the memory of the music, the laughter, and the secrets. It stands as a monument to the Earl who loved it, a stone testament that outlasted the hate that tried to empty it. The exile is over. The silence is broken. The story belongs to us now, us,